Hey everybody, Jeremy here. Welcome back to the Towards Data Science podcast. And today's episode is going to be a little bit unusual. We're talking to somebody who is an expert in law, and specifically in the way that the law tracks technological development. So AI capabilities have been developing faster than ever before, and it seems like every couple months we're hearing about another GPT-3 or another Mu-0 or something that really shakes up the AI ecosystem and dramatically increases the capabilities of AI tech. And that leads to a serious question around whether or not governments are going to be able to keep up with that technology as it develops. Are laws and regulations and policy going to be able to keep up with the capabilities of this technology? So today I'll be talking to Josh Fairfield, who is one of the world's leading experts at answering exactly that question. Josh is a professor of law. He's also a former tech entrepreneur. He worked at Rosetta Stone, which is one of the really big edtech companies, and he's done a bunch of consulting, including at the White House Office of Technology and the Homeland Security Privacy Office. So he's really been steeped in the regulatory environment, thinking about how law can keep up with technology. Really is his bread and butter. So super excited about this conversation. I think it's something that people don't talk about enough. I think it's something that data scientists, like me, like a lot of the people listening, need to think about more, especially as our technology starts to be able to do more stuff and have a way bigger impact on the world. So with that, I'll wrap up this intro and step out of the way. I hope you enjoyed the conversation. Josh, thanks so much for joining me for the podcast.
Hey, thanks so much for having me, Jeremy.
Well, I'm really excited about this conversation because it's an unusual sort of conversation for this podcast. We normally talk about more tech flavored stuff. We talk about futurism. We talk about the future of AI, the trade offs for humanity, all that sort of thing. I think an untold part of that story is the legal side of things. We've talked a lot about like AI as this thing that's going to transform the world. And the subtext there is okay, all of our institutions are going to have to change in some radical way to keep up. But we haven't talked about how that change could conceivably happen. I have a stereotype about the law moving very slowly. I'm sure you're going to be here to debunk a lot of that, but that's, I think, what we'll be talking about a lot today. Before we dive into the meat of it, I'd love to ask for a little bit about your background. Like, how did you discover the space that you're in right now, and also how would you describe the space that you're in right now?
Well, the way that I discovered it, I've been someone who, for the past 20 years, I used to be a tech entrepreneur. So the company that we started was called Rosetta Stone. It started teaching people how to speak foreign languages using software. But then when I entered law, I entered the tech space and specifically was focused on virtual communities, online communities. So I studied early on a lot of things about online games and things like World of Warcraft, virtual currencies. And that then transformed slowly into this interest in how do communities change alongside the technology that's transforming them, right? Because it's not just a one-way street where the technology is pressing change on humans, but how humans use the technology shapes the technology in turn. And so it's exactly what you were saying earlier, tracking the evolution of the institutions of the traditions of things even as simple as ninja looting in World of Warcraft, right? That's a social constraint against a behavior that was occurring within a technological environment.
Mm.
And from that, then I began to notice this line that said law can't keep up or institutions can't keep up with technology. And looking around, it was pretty clear that that just wasn't true at all. That as soon as technology comes out, humans have ideas for how it should and shouldn't be used. So it's not that we're lagging behind in our intuitions about the institutions that we need here. It's that something's gone wrong in our idea of what law is, so that we think law is dusty old books and law codes and not the living language of how we decide to cooperate to deal with the problems of the future. And so that's what then drew me into this space.
Okay, really interesting. I mean, already there's so many things to pull out here. I'll try to just pick one thread and keep myself under some kind of control. So when you talk about, so first off, Rosetta Stone, if anybody's listening to this who's maybe, if you maybe are like 5 years younger than I am, you may not have lived through the era where Rosetta Stone commercials were ubiquitous on TV. Like, this was a huge, huge product. So you go from this world of like, move fast and break things type entrepreneurship. I mean, this really is a fast-paced thing. Are you applying that lens? Like, when you look at the law and how it has to evolve, is it a matter of like adopting some of those lessons, or is there something qualitatively different? Like, are there things you simply can't do to make the law move as fast as a company? Like, what do those constraints look like?
Well, I think the major constraint is, again, our mistaken conceptions about what law is, right? So if we think of law as the end product, here's a great way of expressing it. People often think law can't keep up with technology because they point to statutes that are out of date, that no longer appropriately govern human behavior, right? So there are statutes out there about you have to carry a lantern ahead of your horseless carriage in certain towns, right? And nobody follows those laws anymore. They're just obsolete. And when people point to them and say, oh, that's an example of why law can't keep up with technology. But think about that analogy. That's like pointing to Windows 95, which again, completely obsolete, nobody's using it anymore, right? And saying, oh, because that is obsolete, technology can't keep pace. It's not true. What happens with language is that we develop it as soon as we start talking to each other. So for example, during this conversation, we're going to start working on ideas of what law means. I've already tried to change people's views on what the word law means or what the word language means. Mm-hmm. That's how humans adapt. And when we adapt by changing things like that, we change words to mean new things. We can do that at terrific speed. So one of the things I noticed when I was doing tech entrepreneurship and then transferring that to watching how social institutions can keep up, one of the things that I was sort of struck by when I was doing tech entrepreneurship was not that law was lagging behind technology. It was often that what we needed to do was beg lawyers and judges to just wait a minute. That law was ahead. That they had rules. They were ready to go. They knew what the right analogy was. They were ready to regulate, and we were saying, let the technology mature. Let us catch up. Mm. That's a story you might also have heard, right? So now we have these two conflicting stories: one where law is way behind technology, the other where law is ahead of technology, and technology sort of struggling to take its final form. I'll give an example. You know, when cryptocurrencies and blockchain really exploded, it wasn't at all clear what path things were going to take yet. We have a law for currency. We have a law for commodities. We have a law for taxation. We have a law for record keeping and voting, right? All that law is in place. It was just a question of what form does this blockchain technology take? And we needed to give it a break just for a minute to let it take the form. Once we knew how humans were going to use it, though, then the legal institutions were right there. And I think a lot of people who follow this story about how law can't keep up with technology, they were really surprised to watch how fast law around blockchain evolved. As soon as we saw it being used as a currency, then the Bank Secrecy Act was applied, and anti-money laundering and know your customer requirements were applied. Right? That happened really, really quickly once the technology sort of solidified enough. So that's what I learned there was that it wasn't just that law was trailing behind the technological forefront. It was also that sometimes technology needed space because we already had the law in place. Whatever form that tech was going to take, we knew what the law was going to be. We just didn't know what form the tech was going to take yet. And those two contradictory narratives then led me to this idea that law can keep up with technology because law is technology. It's a social technology, and it can keep up the same way that we develop any other kind of technology. We develop technology by talking about it, by groups of people in rooms doing science, doing programming. In the same way, we develop law by developing new words and concepts. It's our human thing to do things this way. And so the one can keep up with the other. That's the basic idea of the book.
Okay, so to the extent that law is a kind of technology, would you argue for managing the development of law in ways that more closely mirror the way we manage the development of technology? So just as a concrete example, right? Yes, okay. So software engineers and product managers, that sort of thing, or is that?
Or maybe let's try something like law should be humble, iterative, experimental, rather than saying here's the final product and never touching it again. What you're going to do is you're going to do rapid development, right? You're going to do rapid prototyping. So you're going to try to shorten that loop, that development loop. So it's not just sort of engineers management structures, but some of the ideas around provisional work, around the culture and around provisional work. And around having solutions that are good enough and that are constantly being improved upon. rather than the system of, oh, okay, we have the law, it's settled now, we don't go back and we don't address that question again. I think that's one of the key things that we've got to get rid of as lawyers, is this idea that once we've got a legal decision, we don't go back and get it again. Fortunately, we've got a legal system, especially in the United States under the common law, that's really built for doing that. We've just kind of forgotten how. That's built for new cases to bring new questions so that we can always be re-examining the law that we had before. And then the next case comes up and the next case comes up. And we can use that as a form of rapid prototyping to get the kind of iterative, humble, experimental law that more closely matches tech development.
Really interesting. So I imagine, first off, I mean, it just feels like this is the right direction. It feels like something like this has to happen because it also seems inevitable that over time, we're seeing these exponential curves, and in some cases super exponential curves of technological progress. The idea that a static legal system can in any way meaningfully oversee this kind of universe that we're heading into is it doesn't seem terribly tractable. But is there one of the reasons I imagine that law has this sort of static feel to it is the value of that predictability, right? So if the legality of murder or the legality of theft or something like that were to change from not even decade to decade or century to century, but from month to month or week to week, it would make it a lot harder to justify prosecution of people, regulation or regulating in certain ways. How do you see the predictability of laws playing into this whole framework?
Sure. All right. Well, this is a great question because there are two kinds of predictability, right? There's sort of predictability in the form of stasis, but then there's the predictability in change. And one of the things the book says is what we're going to have to do is reimagine law rather than having it be a static system of answers. To turn it into, we're going to have to intermix ideas of innovation and change as necessary to what law is so that it can keep pace. And you talked about, exponential curves, how technological advancement can become exponential, and then we might think of legal progress at best as something like linear, right? Mm-hmm. And yet, there's a predictability to acceleration, right? So that if we can make law accelerate in predictable ways, we can show that it keeps pace. And I'll draw on the question you took about, like murder over the centuries, right? Yeah. In some ways, what we're doing is we're doing the opposite of predictability. When we come with a new technology, and the claim by technologists is this is something so new that prior law can't reach it. Mm-hmm. By the way, that statement has been historically false, right? So Napster made the claim, copyright law can't touch us. Wrong. Creators of virtual worlds said there ought to be a magic circle that hedges out law, and that fraud is fun within the virtual world. So we can commit fraud and you can't apply law. No. Bitcoin enthusiasts said, said financial regulators, the SEC, FinCEN, they can't reach what we're doing. Just again, wrong. But the thing is, there's an unpredictability to the claim that a new technology suddenly disrupts everything, how humans have been doing it before. We can accelerate law by recognizing the analogies that work. Your point about murder. Why is it we would think for a split second that murder through hacking somebody's pacemaker and turning it off is not murder? Oh, it's a new technological feature, right? But why is that any less murder than murder by sword, by club, by pistol, by anything else? Do you see how the change in technology, even rampant change in technology, doesn't change law's ability to go, oh, yep, that's the same murder we've been dealing with for years, not really even break a sweat in covering the new technological case. If you talk about these curves, right, exponential technological curves, the point is that human expectations for law can follow almost a more logarithmic path. So the example I use is the amount of time before, computers have gotten faster and faster. Moore's law has been sort of on and off during our lifetime, but they've gotten faster and faster. And yet my kids still get frustrated that computers are going too slowly, right? That we haven't outpaced the human ability to expect more from these systems yet. And so in a way, yes, technological change is rampant, but even we can take year upon year upon year of doubling the number of transistors in a circuit before human expectations start to get, and the human ability to adapt to the new environment get left behind.
Does this mean something about the kinds of people who need to be practicing law then? Because what you're describing, when we start to say, hacking the pacemaker to kill somebody is murder just the same way as stabbing someone is. So, that's a little easier to map maybe for the average person. But when you get into more and more abstract ideas, I mean, to take it super far, simulated brains running on computer hardware, I don't know what, we get into philosophical territory where it almost feels like the kind of person who has to come up with like what is effectively a legal guidance. I mean, the equivalent of giving a guidance on, hey, here's where the law is going to go in the future. Here are the fundamental principles we're using here. Do we need to look at people who are a little bit more philosophical, better at communicating that philosophy as well? Is that sort of part of the requisite set of skills for the lawyers of the future?
Well, I think so. And I don't know that it's just for lawyers, right? So we've got fairly good science now that shows that the best team to pull together for complex, innovative, non-routine tasks is a team that has profound cognitive diversity, that has different mental skill sets that have been trained in different traditions to come. And so what we're finding out is that adding a sociologist to a software development team, this was a number of studies sponsored by and sort of under the auspices of Google. And if you want sort of books on it, Scott Page's work on it, where what they're saying is that if you've got a team made up of everybody, they're your best people in the field, right? They're your best software designers. So let's say they've got tools A, B, C, and D, right? If you make up a team just out of the very, very best people in that field, they all have the same tools, A, B, C, and D. And you're quite often much better off adding people with tools like EFG, HI, and J, right? Other tools that can come at this from a different direction. So sure, I think that both philosophy in the book does have some philosophy of science in it, trying to say the problem that science has right now is that it doesn't take a look at why we do science, and it doesn't seek an answer for why we do technology. It simply bears down on how we do technology. So I do think that's a skill that needs to be added, but I'll add to that stack. There are many, many other skills that need to be added to this. And when you ask, should we change the kind of person who is doing law? The answer is absolutely, because it shouldn't be a person, it should be people. One of the key things is that we don't develop the kind of language we need to handle the problems of the future alone. We develop it in conversations like this, in conversations between us, where you use words one way, you come at it from one direction, I come at it from another direction. And between us, we build a language that actually gets us somewhere. So to that point, yeah, sure, these are skills that we need to add, but they're skills not just for lawyers, they're skills across the board to build the kind of teams that can innovate for these non-routine, complex new tasks.
And is there new infrastructure that you see being necessary to accomplish this, like new organizations, new ways of essentially supporting the acceleration of this sort of legal language around AI, around emerging technology?
Yeah, in the sense that there are lots of different places in our legal, technological, social structure where we gather these kinds of teams, but we don't really call them by one name, right? So one might be a software development team, right? That might have these kinds of players, and sure, we might have people who come from a little bit further afield. You might have a sociologist, you might have an ethicist that might join that team. In my area, we don't call that a development team, we call that a jury. Right? You're adding a bunch of people with different walks on life and different ways of looking at it, and you're asking them to speak the law into being, to say, under this set of circumstances, given this set of law, is this person guilty or innocent, or is this person liable in a civil suit or not liable in a civil suit? There are places where we detect, you might call it in academia, you might call it a round table or a conference, and some of them really work well. We've got a bunch of people who are able to talk to each other, and a bunch of them, and then it may work very badly, sort of the sage on the stage model, where one person stands up and is sort of proclaiming and everybody else is like, yes, I'm listening to you, but there's not really an exchange of information going on. The thing is, so what I call them in the book is I call them gardens, because they're supposed to grow the kind of language that we need. And I've got some characteristics that those gardens need to have, some structural characteristics, so that we can really get the benefit of people bringing this different expertise to the table. But what I want to point out is that these gardens are actually found in all kinds of different disciplines.
Yeah.
And then what are you going to do? Like merge a jury with a software development team? I mean, maybe, but at least we're thinking in the right direction. How do we merge the kinds of groups with the people who have the different skill sets so that we can think about this stuff in a much, much more robust way?
You alluded to this idea of the pacing problem being solved in part by reference to like past philosophizing, past law, past jurisprudence on a given topic. And then that works well with things like blockchain, as you mentioned, because you can always like draw out an analogy and say, hey, like really cryptocurrency is kind of like regular currency, or it's like a security, or it's like something. And that
Right, it's like
phrase,
something. Yeah.
yeah, it's like
Yeah. That
something.
phrase like, no, but see, like the
Yeah.
like something, that's all of law, right? Like something is the method. Yeah, absolutely.
And then that brings me to a question about things that are, let's say it's along a spectrum, but things that are a lot less like something. So, having new, let's say, for example, there's a step function breakthrough. We've seen some of these, for example, in machine learning recently. OpenAI comes out with GPT-3, and all of a sudden we go from having essentially glorified autocomplete AIs to AIs that can write coherent multi-paragraph essays, that can do web design, that can do this and that. So there's sort of like a sense in which there was no commercial viability to a lot of this technology, and then all of a sudden there is. Or, to take this to a further extreme, projecting 20, 30, 100 years down the line, human level AI or something like that comes out. It seems like this starts to challenge a lot of the core assumptions about even like who's a participatory member of society, what counts as a person. And yeah, I guess I'm just wondering, like, do you see those as still fitting into that same paradigm? There's just a way for us to grapple with it with
Well, I think so, although we're going to have to be pretty careful about this. So, the way that humans have always adapted to problems of the future has been that they've created, we have a superpower as humans. So, there are three species on the planet that can cooperate greater than groups of about 100, ants, bees, and strangely enough, humans. Now, ants and bees do it by evolution, right? They've evolved certain patterns. Bees can indicate, they do a little dance and they say 15 meters that way. The food is 15 meters that way, right? But for a bee to upgrade what's going on, right? The bees can't just decide, let's off the queen and declare a republic,
yeah.
right? Humans can do that. Humans generate this cooperative fiction of a republic. What's that? It's just a consensual hallucination. It's something that we gather ourselves around. So things like money, time, nation states, laws, borders, these are all things that are purely in our minds that we run as a matter of massively parallel social software. We decide that the United States or Canada exists, and it does because it lives in our minds running on that system. All right. Now, what you talked about, what do we do with some of these then stepwise functions in AI that create discontinuities? Well, that's a particularly important one because the discontinuity it's creating is in our language, is in our ability to talk to each other, right? Because now up until now, we have decided the context and meaning of words by using them. We've decided the context and meaning of laws by using them. Right now, a lot of people are discovering that the words they're hearing are selected or promoted algorithmically, or they may even be written algorithmically. And we're now seeing that our language, the way we speak to each other, is being heavily influenced by this human machine interface, by a human machine language. And so when I'm writing a book about, hey, we can keep up with the problems of the future, let's just evolve our language, I think we've got to say, yeah, but what about the fact that we're actually that machines are now speaking as part of our language and are taking more and more of a role of that? I think we can handle it. We're just going to have to call it out and make sure that we understand that there are still human motivations behind the efforts of artificial intelligence. And we may need to do a lot to constrain the use of artificial intelligence if it's influencing people and the way they think and speak in ways that they're not aware of. But we can also get enormous benefit of it. You're seeing the same shift in language that I'm describing. You see it across science, right? When I was in law school 20 years ago, science proceeded by you have a hypothesis first, you then construct your experiment, you then test it out. Not at all, here's a bunch of data, let me just feed that into a neural net and see what interesting things get kicked out of it, right? So, data-driven was almost a curse word when I was going through this, and now science has changed. Now the machines are suggesting our hypotheses when we do science that way, and so we're just going to have to be aware of it. We're going to have to be aware that it costs us in some ways, but there's nothing for it. The only thing we can do is, again, develop ways of talking about it. Say, yes, it's now true. We used to think a Turing test was about a human sitting across from a machine, and can the human tell that the machine is emulating a human? But now it's much more, what about this interesting effect that in the conversation between a human and a machine, both of them start changing how they speak, right?
How do you see the process of evolving that language that's necessary to achieve all this? Like, it seems to me that it might be a rate limiting step at some point if technology really starts to outpace our language's ability to adapt. I'm thinking here, for example, like, when people say things like, oh, I've had such a long week, I just need to reboot this weekend. Like, even subtle things like that.
Sure,
that
sure,
tells you
right?
we're all, yeah. I've even seen it, among people who work in machine learning data science. Like, people will say like, yeah, you know what? I can't remember that article I read, but I dimensionality reduced it to say something like this. And it's like,
Right.
yeah, you're really, you're starting to form that language. But this tends to happen in pockets before it kind of spreads out. And maybe part of the answer is what you're saying, kind of merging people together more. But how do you accelerate the propagation, the proliferation of those new ideas, that new language, so that lawyers and policymakers are actually like aware of these issues fast
Yeah.
enough?
Yeah. I mean, so the step one there is going to be breaking down some walls. You talk about you're addressing lawyers, and the real difficulty that lawyers have is our living is words. So, and lawyers like to think that words have absolute meanings because that's how they draw a paycheck, right? They write this contract and it's supposed to have a meaning, or they write a statute and it's supposed to have a meaning, even though that's not true. A contract is a subject of negotiation, right? And the meaning of words in a contract is wildly open to interpretation, as anybody who's gone through that is aware. But one thing then is to crack open people's ideas about what the words that they use in their bubbles mean, and open them to some sense that other people may be using those words in a different way. And I'll give you a concrete example of that with evolving technology. So there's a series of cases in which judges try to talk about how reasonable the use of technology is to look inside the home. And they'll say things like, oh, you clicked I agree on that contract with Alexa. Therefore, you must be fine with Alexa listening into everything that happens in the phone and handing off those brief snippets of recordings to police officers, as has happened, right? So in that case, if a court says, oh, well, that's reasonable, but why? The court's drawing on its sense of legal reasonableness, and because the person's a lawyer, they're like, oh yeah, if you click a contract, you're bound to that contract, even though you've never read it. Never mind, that's not how other humans are using the word reasonable or privacy at all, right? They're appalled when their Internet of Things devices are gathering information about them that they didn't expect. So opening up treasures of the profession. Reasonableness is the lawyer's like key treasure word, right? We're going to have to loosen our grip on that and say, no, if we're going to decide that police use of technology to intrude upon in the home is based on a reasonableness standard, that reasonableness cannot be a legal term of art. It has to be based on how people are actually feeling, on how people are actually reacting under this technology. So step one in propagating this, that was your question, is to break open some of the shells that these different disciplines have around themselves. Everybody's got their own shells. Computer scientists absolutely have shells around words too, because they're used to working with formal languages. Empirical scientists, they very much want to say, oh, we're just doing science. We don't have any bias. We don't have any meta narrative about why it is that we're doing science in a given way, even though they're working often within a lab team to build a product that's got profit, right? That whole meta narrative is right there. So I think each group definitely has its own shell that's got to get cracked open. And then the thing to do is to import language from other places, to go and seek that out, to listen very hard for people who are using the same words you're using. This is Inigo Montoya's line from The Princess Bride, right? You keep using that word. I do not think it means what you think it means, right? When you get that sense, you keep using that word. I don't think it means what you think it means. That's not a point of disconnect where, okay, technologists and lawyers can no longer do business with each other. No, that's the place where progress becomes possible, where you've now realized, this is where we're not hearing each other. we need to create bridging terms. And then that's my third point. So crack them open, import from other places, then create bridging language. And people who have got a foot in sort of both worlds are really good at bridging language. And so you want to look for those people, bring translators along. You want a sense of how to import this from one place to another, people who can make it comprehensible. So that, and I mean, not just comprehensible in the buzzword sense, right? Lawyers can pull jargon out just like computer scientists can pull jargon out.
Yeah.
But we're talking about people who've got the courage to speak plainly, the people who've got the skill to make it understandable. Those are the ones who are the real translators between these worlds of meaning.
So translators become increasingly important over time. That definitely seems like it's something we're already seeing kind of unfold. As
Absolutely.
You've got, yeah. Now, one thing you mentioned, and this gets to almost a kind of like social, legal, moral philosophy aspect. But when we talk about this idea of reasonableness, and like my dad's a lawyer, so he loves to like loves to rip on the idea of reasonableness, because he's sort of like, he says what you've just said here, right? It's like, well, if a reasonable person would do this and that, then why do we need law if everything is just reasonable?
Right.
So, but there's like this flip side where, you say, okay, now what we need to do is move away from legal definitions of reasonableness and try to map it more onto like, what does the average person mean when they hear the word reasonable, or what they think is reasonable? And I guess this to some degree shifts things from a more objective framework where you're like, okay, reasonableness is this like enshrined abstraction, like it's a thing and it doesn't change over time, to now reasonableness is a thing whose definition depends on context and is effectively socially constructed. And with all the risks that entails too, because I could imagine you could have abuses then of that sort of thing, as if all of a sudden one particular demographic is considered abhorrent or hated in the population, it's like reasonable to hate on them. Yeah, how do you see the balance between those two things? It's sort of, it's almost like populist versus I don't know,
elitist, populist versus elitist, or objective versus subjective. So the one thing to sort of put out there is all words, even words like objective, gather their meaning from use in context, right? And so, for example, one objective measure is how humans are subjectively using words. And I'll make this concrete. The word privacy has a lot of play recently. And the one reason that lawyers tell us we can't have nice things is because, like privacy, is different reasons than technologists tell us we can't have privacy, by the way. But the reason lawyers tell us we can't have privacy is because they tell us privacy doesn't mean any one thing. It doesn't have an essence, right?
Neither does Apple, I guess.
Yeah, neither does Apple. Neither does liberty. Neither does freedom. Neither does security. Neither do any words that lie at the center of our way of seeing the world. In fact, the closer that a word lies to the center of how we think, the more meanings it's got. Right? The word to run has 645 different meanings in the English language. Right? So when we talk about this problem of how we use words, there is this difficulty that how humans use them does cause the meaning of words to shift, and important meanings like privacy, like security, even like the word technology, right? Today I'm trying to convince you and others to see technology as including law, right? I'm trying to change the meaning of that word. So then what do you do when enough people start using a word in a way that is dangerous, or in a way that is going to be an attack on another group, something like that? The important thing to see about how words work is that neither the objective fixed view is right, nor the subjective, it can mean whatever you want view is right. Right? I can decide that up means down secretly, but that doesn't work. If I say up, everybody understands it means up, not down, right? If I say yes, everybody understands I meant yes, even though I might privately mean no in my mind. So the way I think about language is they're kind of like a galaxy. Words are like a galaxy. They float in space, right? But they maintain some kind of pattern of relationship to each other. And that pattern is sticky. People say, no, you're using those words wrongly. I might not be able to tell you what reasonable is, but there are some cases where I can tell you that a person is acting unreasonably, and everybody else goes, yeah, that was pretty unreasonable. Like if you're driving drunk, that's pretty unreasonable across the board, right? So so we can say then what we do when language starts to drift out of control. And it's a real problem. Anybody who's been paying attention to the national conversation or the international conversation in the past, say half decade, has noticed our language is fragmenting and spinning out of control in some circumstances. And how do you address that? It turns out there's only one answer. You have to get in conversation with people who have different uses of words. You have to get in close to them. Every study shows you get in close, you rely on a personal relationship, and then you assert that the word means something differently. And I think we've all had that conversation, whether that's a conversation about race, about gender, about religion. We've all had that experience of needing to get in closer to somebody and say, now, wait a minute. You're using words in a way that are abstract, in a way that's ascribing characteristics to people that simply aren't true. Let me get in close and say, do you really mean that? And can you hear how I'm using the word instead? And that's the only answer we found so far is get in close and use the words the way they were intended to be used.
Yeah, it's so fascinating. The common denominator in all those scenarios is people are almost always more well-meaning, more generous than you expect once you can understand what the boundaries are around their actual internal definition of these words.
Yes, I mean, you often have that sense that once you understand how somebody's speaking, you often have this moment of, oh, you're sort of we're a lot closer than we thought we were.
Yeah.
Right.
One of the things this really makes me think of, it's almost inescapable, is the theory of language, and how that ties in actually to machine learning. So, for example, when we do machine learning, what we're often doing when we train a language model, for example, is we represent words as vectors, as like a list of numbers that lives in high dimensional space. And every word, so if you look at word2vec, which was an algorithm that came out in like 2012, it's like one of the first really successful algorithms that generated one of these word vectors. What you get, so the word vector for apple is this like set of 200 different numbers. And to your point, like you have this like galaxy of different words, like the word, banana, the word apple, they're kind of close to each other because they have similar meanings. Further away, you have dog and you have leash, and those are kind of close together and so on. But the structure, the shape of that basically encodes all human knowledge and the relationships between words, that shape will not only shift over time, but it'll also shift with different algorithms. So if you look at OpenAI's GPT-3, it's not going to encode the word dog in the same way that Word2Vec back in 2012 encoded dog, not just because there's been technological advance in the meantime, but also just because the context that it was trained on was slightly different, the data was slightly different. Even if you're looking at the same data set, just stochastic random noise will cause differences. And so we all end up with like this slightly different world model in our heads. And so there's like some ball of meaning around a given word, I guess, that hopefully they overlap enough that we can actually connect.
Right, and the way to do it is to use those word clouds, right? Because then we're beginning, because what you're doing is you're creating further connections, and it's neat that these algorithms are trained on different data sets, because what they're doing is they're onboarding algorithms that we ourselves are running, right? They're onboarding the contexts, right? Computers didn't learn language well until we learned to go after massive numbers of instances of human use, rather than the sort of early efforts to teach natural language processing by teaching somebody the rules of French, right? That didn't work. To teach the formal rules of French. But now we've moved to where we're picking up all of these different meanings. So we're both learning it from many of us, and then as we use it, we're shifting the map of our own internal set of that cloud, our own internal set of that sort of set of meanings. So yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it's also interesting to see, like, especially with more advanced systems like GPT-3, it is almost as if it can do an impression of different people. Fundamentally, what GPT-3's done, right, is it's just trying to be really good at predicting the next word in a sentence. Ultimately, that's all it's doing. So if the start of that sentence is something like, a speech from Adolf Hitler, you can expect like it should try to fill in the words as interpreted as used by Adolf Hitler. So in a way, it's almost as if these algorithms are able to simultaneously hold different word clouds, different interpretations of different words in their heads at the same time, which I guess to some degree is also what hopefully a successfully conversant human being can do as well. Like they can.
I was going to say, that was going to be my follow-up. Is here we're seeing convergence, right? Think about going from your group of university friends to work to, right, in all of the different social contexts in which we operate. And I will be shocked if your language doesn't shift radically, and
Yeah.
if the next word to come out of your mouth doesn't shift radically. That's in fact how language works. It's just the fact that we're doing it computationally means we're revealing the structure of the thing. We've finally gotten to how it actually works.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a fascinating problem how it interacts with such sort of fundamental things. On the more practical side, the economics of this process are also really interesting. I mean, you have this rapidly evolving technology. You have people who are paid extraordinarily high amounts to develop this rapidly evolving technology. Um, I imagine that there's like one of the challenges here, and I've heard this talked about like when I speak to people who work on AI policy, there's like this selective effect where if you really deeply understand AI, the place you'll tend to go is the private sector. Like you'll go get a job at Google, you'll work at DeepMind or whatever. Like the best people in the world are sucked away in that sense. And that makes it difficult for like policymakers who work in government, public servants, that sort of thing, to tap into that language at the same rate that they might need otherwise to kind of keep track of things. Um, like, is that an open problem in your mind? Is that something that we're going to be able to solve, that sort of economic gradient that pushes people who deeply understand tech away from policy?
At both a deep and at a surface level. So I'll sort of start with the surface level. Yes, it's absolutely a difficulty. Although it is also a difficulty that runs in multiple directions. So for example, it's quite often the case that products get built from the ground up without a deep understanding of what the law is and that database of past history and analogy. They don't have a sense as to which way the system's going to jump in response to these things. And the sort of move fast and break things ethos doesn't quite help when you're getting your door knocked on by a regulatory agency for reasons that would have been perfectly predictable at the time. So I do think that there are multiple professions where you've got people who are highly paid. They sort of gravitate toward the center of their industries, and that can draw them away from the edges where the translation needs to happen, right? So I think it's a problem that's not just one of AI. It's a way in which we compensate expertise. It's a way in which we reward expertise. And to that then deeper point, I do think that there are other ways of doing science. It's not inevitable that we simply say the private sector can draw everyone away. We can, one counterexample, obviously there are reasons to think that it does or doesn't work. Sometimes it really doesn't work. But public financing can be one of them. But there are a number of other ways in which we do science that isn't just for the purpose of gathering profit under a certain circumstance. That doesn't fix this issue, right? Because we can make enormous amounts of money. People do want to be highly compensated. And there's a further centering effect, especially with artificial intelligence, which is you have to go to the people who are able to gather the massive data sets. Or you need to be able to feed your AI. And so the Facebooks of the world, the Googles of the world, especially when we're dealing with AIs that are trying to learn human behavior and are trying to sort of build an interface with human behavior, you're going to have to go to the people who've got that massive setup. So I think we do have a surface level problem, which is all professions draw expertise to the center, and we're going to need to make the case for. And I think there is good science sort of increasingly making the straight up economic case for cognitive diversity in your team sets, which we talked a little bit about earlier. That would mean you might want to consider highly compensating a sociologist,
Yeah.
or it may mean that the Patent and Trademark Office, and this is just a sort of something that I've been in my high horse, but the Patent and Trademark Office needs to just pay whatever it takes in order to get some people on staff who really understand this technology. Because of the enormous numbers of patents that are being improvidently granted for stuff that, for example, was obvious to every other practitioner. It's just somebody else got first to file on it. So I think that you do need to sort of step it up in some senses, increasing public funds so that they can try to draw some of these people away. And you don't even need to match private sector salaries. There are people who really want to do science in a different way for a different motive. So you're not going to have to even get the salaries anywhere competitive. You are going to have to make sure that people are taken care of. And then maybe a third, we might try to more create pipelines for these people who can translate between worlds.
Yeah, actually, it's funny. This sort of reminds me of a related issue, which is when I think it was OpenAI. When OpenAI was founded, as a nonprofit, I think it was like 2015, people complained that I think it was the CTO, Greg Brockman, I'm not sure, was one of them anyway, was receiving like a, $1 million a year salary or something like that. And OpenAI was nominally a nonprofit. And so people said, what are you doing? This is a nonprofit and you're, taking $1 million a year salaries.
Sure.
But it's like, if that's the going rate, ultimately, you like, what do you want? You want a nonprofit where the leadership is clueless and not market competitive, like an ineffective nonprofit? That's kind of part of, I guess that it's almost an aesthetic thing at a certain point, and it's challenging to argue for that in government. But sorry, go ahead.
It is. I mean, it is. It's also true, though. You have to keep an eye on that ball, right? So there are ways in which people are compensated well beyond the value that they bring to a firm. And we don't have time to really get into that now, but if we look, for example, at around the world and if we just pick around the world in highly innovative countries, so countries that rank at the top for numbers of patents filed, for the economic value of the patents filed, what we find is that there's actually a huge range in executive compensation, and that there are places in the world that remain incredibly competitive without letting executive compensation itself fly off the handle. So I do think that for rank and file engineers, the numbers have got to, like people who know the tech and are building the tech, the numbers have just got to come up and they've got to be competitive, because there you're looking at the market. You're saying, like, are you producing things that bring in this kind of revenue or generate this kind of value? And that's much more easy to track. But there is a point at which you really can see a divergence between the value you bring to a firm, or between the value an employee brings to a firm and their compensation. And you do have to sort of watch that at the top end.
Yeah, and it definitely seems like one of the ways in which that's compensated for in the private sector, at least, is like the idea of equity. Like, you work for a company and like,
Sure. Yeah.
you might be paid $100K a year, but if you own like 0.5% of a potential Google or something,
then you're going to be tied to it. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, which I guess in government is a lot harder too, because you're trying to get people to give up on potentially that moonshot. So harder to make that argument.
Right.
Interesting.
Absolutely.
So are you overall, it seems like you're optimistic about this, that we're able to do this. Do you think that there's enough of an appetite right now to start to move in this direction, start to maybe even enact, I don't know if it would be legislation. Actually, yeah. So what are your thoughts about what has to happen next in order to move in this direction?
Sure. Well, so we're actually well launched on this path, although I think the conversation in the United States has lagged behind about the institutional side of things, right? That's where our conversation started, about developing our social institutions alongside our technological innovation. And I think that's largely because our technological innovation has been just amazing, has been stellar. We've just gone clear out, and that's where everybody's been keeping their eye on that ball. We're actually well into the process of dealing with this stuff. So while the United States, for example, hasn't passed serious substantive rules, serious substantive law on privacy, the European Union has done it not just once, but then several decades later has done it, like has looked at the problems, has decided, hey, this was working, hey, this wasn't working, and has done it again. Now, is the European GDPR spectacular? Is it perfect? Not by any stretch of the imagination. But what it is, functionally speaking, is the language that is now being spoken worldwide. And I don't know that, like, you just can't gainsay that. That is fact worldwide when people are talking about privacy law, when they're talking about the model, the language that they're going to draw when a country comes to write its own statutes. Heck, when California came to pass its own statutes that then heavily impact Silicon Valley, the usual way of things, which is tech law tends to be thought about first at the sources of innovation where people are building it and then radiate out from there. What we're seeing is, because we have abdicated this conversation, we've delayed this conversation too long, it's actually not working that way anymore. And now legal language is being imported from the rest of the world and is really driving a lot of this language that we're seeing in all of these state law privacy statutes. So Washington, California, and a number of other states that are passing these privacy laws right now. So worldwide, we're well into this conversation. The United States is going to go through a period of catch-up, and U.S. companies are sometimes finding it quite uncomfortable for legitimate and illegitimate reasons. I mean, there are definite questions of how U.S. companies are treated in European courts, and I'll be the first to say there are some serious problems there. But beyond that, what they're finding is they're not able to just stop the conversation anymore by this sort of dual statement Either law can't keep up with technology, it's old, it's dusty, or it's too soon for law, right? It's either too late for law or it's too soon for law in our conversation. It's never really the right time to sit down and say, we need to think about what these technologies are doing to our social institutions and how we can adapt them in a way that permits the technology to carry forward and to actually move faster than it would if we didn't always have the brakes on our social institutions. Because if our social institutions can't evolve, we can't get to a comfortable place where we can really then provide the guidance and let technology rip and let it go as quickly as it can go. So I am optimistic that our superpower is language. Our superpower has been talking things out, coming up with new ways of looking at the world. It's gotten us through a heck of a couple of bumps. I mean, if you think about the bump of industrialization in particular, like that was just a hell of a step where you're not just moving all of our interactions from conferences to Zoom. I mean, this is pleasant. It's a conversation like many other conversations I've had. It's not wildly different. But if you think about moving in from a rural landscape into an urban center, nobody had any idea how to make urban centers not an industrial hellscape, right?
Yeah.
We had huge shifts at that time, and we talked it out, and we developed things like thoughts about sustainability, environmentalism. We created things like housing codes. We changed all of our law of property to make sure that housing was habitable and not just horrible to live in. Like those are changes in my discipline, but the technological changes are the same. And we worked that out moderately well over about 100 years. My guess is we're going to do just fine with this set, as long as we give up the idea that we can't do it. And that's the part that really does worry me, because the idea that law can't keep up with technology is something that draws most people's nodding heads. Like if you just go out and have a drink with a bunch of people who work in tech, you're like, yeah, man, law just can't keep up. Most of the people around the table are like, yeah, like that's just the truth. If we do that, if we abdicate the effort to upgrade and to evolve our ways of talking about this in our social institutions, and we ignore our clear ability to do this in other areas, right? We're developing our social institutions incredibly rapidly around many other areas of justice. And yet somehow here, technology seems to sort of be in stasis with respect to the response of institutions and law in general. And so I think the thing then to do is to pay a lot less attention to statutes, and to pay a lot more attention to how the language is evolving. And I think that we're already beginning to do that. So if you want to know what worries Facebook is not Section 5 of the FTC Act. What worries Facebook is when there's this growing public backlash around the WhatsApp terms of use, right? When people make a massive shift to Signal. That's, in my definition, that's law. That's people taking action together based on a conversation that they've had about the value of this, and they've now migrated at a mass scale. Those sorts of things, that's the living edge of the law, right? If you think of law kind of like a coral reef, you could think of the old dusty law books as like the bulk of the reef, but then the living edge of it, where the flame sort of is creeping along the page, right? If you light a piece of paper, you watch the flame creep along. That living edge is where people are talking about it. It's on Twitter, it's on Facebook, it's talked about over Discord. It's the place where we're developing these new words and these new reactions to the technology. I think that we can shorten the cycle between that new language being developed and getting it into something that people can act on as a matter of governance. I'll go right back to reasonableness as a standard. What is reasonable can change really fast if we're relying on looking at a generation and how they use technology and what is reasonable use of that technology. Is it reasonable to scrape somebody's Discord chat? Is it reasonable to merge somebody's features into a responsive advertisement in order to persuade them to purchase something or to vote in a certain way? When we tie the legal standards to how people are reacting to it right now, we get rules, we get standards that can move much, much more quickly as people's views change.
It sort of seems like this implies shorter response times also imply less thinking about the long-term effects of these potential laws, right? So if for example we say, okay, you're not allowed to use deep fakes, right? like conceivably through some sort of butterfly effect type thing, maybe that's a good thing or a bad thing in the long run. Maybe we'd want people
I
to
mean,
be
we
able
wouldn't
to.
have the last episode of the former season of Mandalorian, among other things, right? I
Yeah,
mean, Luke Skywalker showed up. This was important.
that's the thing of such things as great civilization made. So
Right, right,
like
right.
I mean, these things are always hard to predict, but it's also conceivable the argument could be made that like we need some time to contemplate to, in Canada, for example, we have the Senate, which is the place of so-called sober second thought. When the House passes legislation, you have people who look and say, whoa, 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 kids, like a straight
Let's
democracy
not
is
go crazy
cool.
here,
But
right?
yeah, yeah, yeah. So because there's always this natural tension, right? I mean, like you have one end of it is like the relative stagnancy of like Sparta, and then at the other end is like the dangerous revolutionary zeal of like, yeah, revolutionary France or something. So like choosing, I guess, the right spot in between those two. It sounds like it's a matter of shifting more in one direction than another. Would that be a fair characterization?
It is with one important sort of touch back to something we said earlier. This works best if we make sure that law becomes humble, iterative, and experimental. And by humble, I mean we're dealing because law is also and human systems are in a way that we maybe don't have sort of time to go into, but human systems are path dependent. That what we thought about before, how we thought about it before, leads to the next step, leads to the next step, leads to the next step. So if we think of law as setting a rule for all time, far into the future, we're going to make really bad law. That's
Yeah.
one of the problems with all these obsolete laws that everybody's pointing to them and saying that law doesn't work. I mean, it's kind of like pointing again. It's kind of like pointing to obsolete technology and saying technology doesn't work. What needs to happen is we need to stop using them. We need to get rid of them and iterate. So humble means we don't look all that far into the future. Iterative means and experimental means we try new stuff, and iterative means we always come back to it. We never say this is done, because that really does create the problem that we made a determination for where we are now, and then that's going to cast a long shadow into the future, and we're not going to have the very flexibility we've been trying to build into the law here. So what you want is a much closer, a much tighter loop and so the playoff between taking sort of a more close look at how people are thinking and how people are reacting to and how people are their lived experience. This is the famous line of Oliver Wendell Holmes, who says, the life of the law is not logic, but experience. It's the lived experience of humans that's the raw material of law. That can be that's a data set. We can ask people how they're doing under these circumstances. And a lot of people are doing pretty badly right now. We can do better than this. But then the payoff has got to be that the rules we make this way can't have this long shadow. We've got to have a way of constantly revisiting, constantly updating them on a tighter loop.
I love it. I mean, great theme, and it really resonates with, again, what I've been hearing from talking to a couple folks in AI policy. It seems like the kind of thing that needs to happen. Josh, thanks so much, everybody. The book is Runaway Technology. Can law keep up? And I think it's going to be one of these things that people will be turning back to over and over, not just with respect to AI, but blockchain, VR, AR. I mean, everything is transforming in a way that I think is going to make this more relevant. So, Josh, thanks so much. I really appreciate it.
Hey, thanks so much for having me. I appreciate being here.